Sonic Adventure DX is a game all about going fast and destroying as many enemies as you can. But have you ever wondered if you can beat the entire game without destroying a single enemy? That's what we're going to be figuring out today. The only exception to this rule is the bosses, seeing as there's no feasible way to bypass them. But other than that, everyone else must remain alive or else I have to reset. I'll be keeping track of our progress on this nifty little kill count sheet I've made so that we don't lose count along the way. And yeah, that's basically it. So, put on your pacifist shoes and let's get to it. First up was the fight against Chaos, or Chaos Zero to be exact. Since this is classified as a boss battle, I just defeated him like normal and moved on from there. After an incredibly cheesy cutscene, it was time for our first big level, Emerald Coast. This stage didn't have very many enemies, so it was incredibly easy. I beat it on my first try. But one thing I learned was that I should try to refrain from jumping and spin dashing as much as possible. Doing either of these things makes it more likely for me to accidentally destroy an enemy by mistake, so that's why I'll be playing pretty slow for most of this playthrough. It might not be as much fun, but I've got to do whatever I can to keep a clean record, you know what I'm saying? I also checked around the hub world to see if there were any enemies roaming around, and of course there weren't any, which wouldn't really make much sense anyway. And with that, I was off to Mystic Ruins. After getting to Tails' workshop, I had a quick fight against the Egg Hornet, which was very simple to complete. Then after that was Windy Valley. This is the first level where you have Tails following you from behind, and I was worried at first that Tails might try attacking nearby enemies, since that's how he functions in the 2D games. But to my knowledge, Tails doesn't have that ability in this game, as he didn't go after a single badnik. Or so I thought. When I got to the end of the stage, I noticed that I had an enemy score of 10, meaning Tails had defeated an enemy along the way. Or maybe it was me and I just didn't notice, but either way, it still wasn't good enough for me. So I tried the level again while going much slower, and this time around, I was able to get the score I was looking for. Casinopolis was undoubtedly the easiest stage in this entire challenge, and that's because there weren't any enemies in the casino. There is an underground part to this level that does have some badniks in it, but as long as you're careful, that area can be avoided entirely. So after playing some pinball and taking a well-deserved shower in a public restroom, I collected the next Chaos Emerald, and that was that. Up next was Ice Cap, and just like every other stage so far, it too contained almost no enemies. So far, it looks like this challenge is going to be much easier than I expected, but I know for a fact that the later levels are really going to give us a hard time. Ugh. Following all that was a quick tussle with Knuckles. And can we just talk for a second about how funny the voice lines are in this game? Like, I know they're bad and all, but there's just something about the way Knuckles says, "Oh no," that just cracks me up. After that was a fight against Chaos 4, and just like the last Chaos fight, it was entirely painless. But then came Act 1 of Sky Chase. I was under the assumption that shooting down missiles launched by the egg carrier surely would not count as destroying enemies. But guess what? I got to the end of the stage only for it to give me an enemy score. Of course. So I went back and tried the level again, this time without shooting at anything. Just to be safe, I even avoid running into the missiles and blowing them up that way. This doesn't add to your enemy score or anything, but it just felt right letting all of the missiles get away safely. I guess you could say I went above and beyond. Get it? Because we're above everything? Oh, come on, that was a good joke. Now it's time to follow Amy to Twinkle Park. One awkward conversation later, all I have to do is hop into one of these bumper cars and... oh. You have to destroy the enemies inside the bumper cars to get one. Oh no! Things were looking pretty grim at first, but I already had a couple of ideas hatching. I looked around the stage to see if there were any extra bumper cars laying around without badniks inside them, and of course there weren't any. So then I turned to the speedrunning community. I scoured through dozens of past speedruns to see if there were any sort of skips I could use to bypass this section. But unfortunately, every speedrun I watched had Sonic hijacking one of the enemy's bumper cars. At this point, I was starting to become desperate. I tried for almost an hour to clip myself through the door using every means possible. This game's pretty glitchy, so I thought maybe there was a chance I could break through the barrier. But I'm pretty sure there's an invisible wall here anyway, so this was out of the question. My last trick was to try and bypass this level entirely by entering Speed Highway early. And while I was able to do so by glitching through the door that Knuckles usually uses to get there, even after I beat it, the game still wanted me to do Twinkle Park. So unfortunately, no. It is not possible to beat Sonic Adventure DX without defeating a single enemy. It's crazy to think how this challenge went from being really easy to flat out impossible in just a matter of seconds. It's unfortunate, but let's continue onwards and see how many deaths are required to beat Sonic Adventure DX. After committing our first felony, I thought that everything would be okay from there. But boy was I wrong! Our first problem comes with the racetrack section. I had forgotten just how many enemies were on the course, which made trying to avoid them all an almost impossible feat. On one hand, I couldn't go too fast, or else I'd end up destroying a badnik. But on the other hand, I couldn't go too slow because the guys driving the bumper cars will follow you if you aren't going fast enough, making it more likely for you to hit them! I had to retry this stage so many times, but eventually, I memorized the route I needed to take in order for me to bypass all my troubles. But then came the second half of the level. I thought that since I was out of the bumper car now, this part would be a lot easier. But unfortunately for me, that wasn't at all the case. The main issue was these Kikis. They attack Sonic by throwing bombs at him, which isn't hard at all for me to avoid. The problem is their bombs can also hurt them if they're standing too close to the explosion. Now, normally I'd just do my best not to get noticed by the Kikis so as to not trigger their bomb attack. But because the path here is so linear, it's physically impossible to pass by them without them noticing you! Not to mention, some of these guys are standing on literal dynamite, which can also kill them if it explodes! I tried my best to save as many of them as I could, but no matter which path I took, there were always at least a few casualties. However, when I got to the end, the game didn't count any of these deaths towards my enemy score. I only had the 10 points from the badnik at the beginning. I think what happened is that the game doesn't count enemy deaths that weren't resulted by the player, which makes sense. I mean, after all, I'm not the one who told these stupid monkeys to stand on top of dynamite and light literal bombs on fire. I promise, it was all them! I understand if you want to count this as destroying enemies, since they are technically enemies that are being destroyed. But seeing as how I didn't necessarily have a hand in their murder, I think it's alright if we don't add these guys to our total. Finally, it was time to move on to Stage 6, Speed Highway. If it would let me! Yeah, because I went to Speed Highway early while trying to skip over Twinkle Park, the game thinks I already finished Speed Highway and won't unlock the door for me. However, part of the game still wants me to go there, seeing as I'm not able to trigger the right cutscenes I need in order to advance the game. So this is why my parents always warned me about sequence breaking. Thankfully, we can still use the same trick as before to get into Knuckles' entrance to Speed Highway. This level has tons more enemies than the previous ones we've been in. But unlike those, this stage is much more open, making it far easier to get around any potential threats. Even this part where you're supposed to use your homing attack on these enemies to get across this gap can be cleared with enough speed. And just like that, that's another level done with no enemies killed. Nice! Now for the moment of truth.
Amy? Oh man, where can she be?
Whew, After returning to Mystic Ruins, I unlocked Ancient Light and headed over to Red Canyon. But first, I had to destroy the Kiki in this cage, son of a... I looked everywhere to see if there was any sort of speedrun strat I could use to get into Red Mountain without destroying the Kiki. But unfortunately, the loading zone for this stage doesn't appear until the Kiki is destroyed, so that's another tally for the kill count! Red Canyon was much more tricky to complete than most of the other levels so far. This is the point where the game wants you to start destroying enemies in order to cross over large bottomless pits, so this is when I had to start getting creative. There were several instances where I had to find alternate paths just to make progress, and a few jumps here and there were pretty scary, but with enough routing, I completed the stage with very little effort. But now it was time for Act 2 of Sky Chase. And I'll admit, I was pretty worried at first, seeing how difficult the first act was. But surprisingly, I got it down in only about 20 minutes. Except for the part where you have to attack the egg carrier by shooting at it while it's launching missiles at you that count towards your enemy score if they explode, and oh, come on!
I'm gonna need some more paper.
Now this brings up an interesting debate. Do I count these missiles as enemies since they're the exact same as the other ones? Or do I exclude them due to the fact that they're being destroyed during a boss fight? Personally, I'm leaning more towards not counting them, as these missiles feel more like an extension of the boss battle rather than a group of sporadic enemies. And besides, I'm almost certain that it is possible to defeat the boss without exploding any of the missiles anyway. I wasn't able to do this myself, but I think that with enough practice, this task could prove to be possible. If anyone out there wants to give this a try, then by all means, go for it. But now that we've cleared that up, let's get back to the challenge. Oh, Skydeck, my favorite level from Sonic Adventure. Hopefully you treat us better than the rest of these filthy crime-ridden stages. And to my surprise, this level wasn't nearly as challenging as I'd thought it'd be. There were several tricky jumps I had to make, and a few of the routes weren't possible due to the placement of several enemies. But after only a few resets, I managed to sneak by with a clean record. Oh, and in case you're wondering about the part where you have to destroy the huge cannon with the rockets, that part didn't count towards my enemy score, so I guess it's another get out of jail for free card. Following that were the boss fights against E102 Gamma and Chaos 6. And let me just say, it feels so good to be able to attack something again. You have no idea how hard it is to resist the temptation to spin dash into all these badniks. You really have no idea. But then came along Lost World and ugh. No, not that one. This one. This stage is my least favorite one in the game, and just like usual, it took forever until I got to the end. There wasn't anything too particularly noteworthy about it, aside from the fact that there were almost no enemies along the way. And before I knew it, I was at the last level, Final Egg. This was definitely one of the hardest stages I had to play through. It wasn't as bad as, say, Twinkle Park, but it was still absolutely dreadful. I had to make numerous scary jumps over bottomless pits, and even sometimes used the spin dash to get around certain parts. But after lots of trial and error, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel. Because once I saw that precious 0 next to my enemy score, I knew that it was over. I defeated Eggman and his Egg Viper, and just like that, we have completed Sonic Adventure DX while defeating as few enemies as possible. So, how many innocent civilians did we have to slay along the way? Well, in case you forgot, the answer is 2. They were the victim of vehicular manslaughter and the casualty of prison brutality. But honestly, these murders were absolutely necessary in order to beat Sonic's story, so I think 2 is about as good as we can do, at least for now. Maybe one day someone will find a strategy to make that number decrease even further, but I'm completely content with how far I've gotten today.
Well, I did it. It wasn't easy, but I mean, come on. I should be proud of this. I think this calls for celebration, and I think I'm going to do so by playing a video game. Let's see what I've got. Mario Wonder, Dog Island, no, the rest of the character stages from Sonic Adventure DX.
Oh no!
Tails' story starts with a boss fight against the Acornet. And as we've already established, boss fights are fair game. The first level I had to tackle was Windy Valley. And unlike Sonic's version of the stage, this time I was under a lot more pressure. The way Tails levels work is that you have to race Sonic to the Chaos Emerald, essentially meaning I'm now on a time limit. Thankfully, this stage had lots of shortcuts for me to take, so getting to the end fast enough was no problem. And in terms of enemies, I didn't really see any anywhere. Maybe there were a few that I missed because of all the shortcuts I took, but I got an enemy score of 0 on my first try, so I'm not complaining. Casinopolis was a similar story. This time around, there were several enemies I could actually see, but as long as I moved around them, they could be easily dealt with. This level was a little more tense, as Sonic managed to get in front of me a few times. But in the end, I pulled through and beat the stage enemyless on my first try. Enemyless. Is that a word? I don't know. Well, I'm making it a word. It's in the dictionary now, boy. If you didn't already think this challenge was easy enough, well, the next couple levels will surely prove you wrong. Ice Cap was literally just the snowboarding portion from Sonic's stage, which didn't feature a single enemy. And after that was the annual Rumble with Knuckles, which I somehow died at because I forgot to grab any rings, but we don't talk about that, okay? Then there was the battle against Chaos 4, which was easy peasy, and then Act 1 of Sky Chase. It was exactly the same as when I did it with Sonic, so it too could be completed easily. And the same thing could also be said for Sand Hill. Not long after, I picked up Tails' Rhythm Badge, which I don't think I'd ever done before. And I've just gotta say, this move looks ridiculous. How did I not know this existed until now? Anyways, Act 2 of Sky Chase was my next destination, and boy did this one take a while. It was such a pain in the rear end trying to dodge all the missiles, as running into them always increased my enemy score. But just like it was in Sonic's story, this sub-game was 100% possible. Next up was Skydeck. And as you probably expected, there really wasn't too much going on. Tails' ability to fly makes avoiding all enemies a cakewalk. So, even when there's lots of them all in one area, all I have to do is float right over them and that's the end of it. After duking it out with Gamma, I traveled all the way back down to Earth for Speed Highway. And guess what? There were actually more than 2 enemies throughout the entire stage! Can you believe it? Even so, they were still really easy to get around because again, flying, which got me to the end no problemo. And once that was complete, I defeated the Egg Walker, which meant I was done. So yes, it is indeed possible to beat Tails' story without defeating a single enemy. It feels so good to be successful in one of these challenges for once. But we're not done yet. On to the next one. Knuckles' first level was coincidentally Speed Highway. However, instead of trying to get to the end of the stage like we were before, Knuckles levels have you exploring large enclosed areas looking for shards of the Master Emerald. And one thing I quickly learned about these shards is that sometimes they spawn inside of enemies, meaning I have to destroy them. Luckily, the locations where the shards spawn is up to RNG, so if this ever happens, I can always just reset and try again. The first stage of mine had loads of enemies roaming about. In fact, it was so bad that I pretty much had to stay on the rooftops just to stay away from them. Thankfully, luck was on my side as I collected all of the shards on my first try. Next up was Casinopolis, and right away, it was already proving to be much more tedious. Despite the fact that there were dozens of spots where the shards could appear, every single time at least one of them spawned inside an enemy. I must have restarted this level 100 times, and yet every time I did, there was always one hiding within an enemy. But after over an hour of attempts, I finally gave up? Yeah, I'm sorry, but I just couldn't do it. I don't know if it was just bad luck, or if the game literally requires one of the shards to always be inside an enemy. But either way, I just couldn't take it anymore. I mean, there's only so many times I can get made fun of by those stupid flying robots before I throw in the towel, you know? So unfortunately, no, Knuckles' story is not possible without defeating a single enemy. It's a tragedy, I know. But let's at least keep going and see what the least amount of deaths are needed in order to beat Knuckles' story in Sonic Adventure DX. With blood fresh on my hands, I confronted Dr. Eggman and defeated Chaos 2. After hearing a story about Sonic stealing the Master Emerald shards that could in no way be untrue, I head back towards Mystic Ruins to unlock Knuckles' Shovel Claw, an upgrade that is most definitely needed in order to beat his story. I wonder what this button does.
Okay, you win again, game!
Well, at least I'll never have to do that again.
Alright, fine. I didn't even want to be innocent anyway.
Red Mountain was at the very least not impossible. I was having the same issues as I was back in Casinopolis. But after only a dozen or so resets, I collected all of the shards without a single casualty. Hopefully that's enough to clear my record. Soon after, I was playing Sonic and Knuckles, fighting with Sonic, and you know the drill. Then I vanquished Chaos 4, returned to the light side, and continued on to Lost World. This stage was actually a lot easier than I was expecting. I didn't even have to restart once. However, I did just want to point out that the developers put in all these gravity-changing wall mechanics for the player to solve. But Knuckles is able to climb on every surface in here, so it's literally pointless. I just thought that was kind of funny. Once that was finished, it was time for the last level, Sky Deck. This one took quite a few tries, as there were many enemies that could have shards spawn inside them. But the moment I got some good RNG, I knew I was all set. I defeated Chaos 6, restored the Master Emerald, and then Knuckles' story was finally complete. In total, Knuckles defeated 3 enemies, which is the most we've had so far. But hey, it could have been a lot worse, so hopefully that counts for something. Amy's story was up next, and this one was quite a doozy. Amy's levels involve her getting chased by Zero, one of Eggman's badniks, and the goal is to get to the end of the stage without getting captured by him. However, you're able to stun Zero with your Pico Pico hammer in order to get away from him. Doing this doesn't go towards your enemy score, but as an added challenge, I decided I wasn't going to attack him either. I mean, we've already saved so many lives, one more couldn't possibly hurt. right? Anyways, Twinkle Park had a surprising number of enemies scattered about. I was a bit worried at first, since some of them were in really tight corridors, right where the camera just loves to cooperate. But by damage boosting through all of them, these enemies were no sweat. Not even Zero could keep up with me most of the time, so I guess that's an added bonus. After witnessing the most tear-jerking cutscene I've ever seen.
I pity you. Love is not part of your programming. You are missing something good. Hey, Birdie, come back here.
I proceeded onward to Hot Shelter. Like with Twinkle Park, there were lots of enemies in small enclosed spaces. But again, getting around them was no issue for me at that point. The only struggle was trying to do all of the colored block puzzles with Zero right on my tail. But with enough practice, this level wasn't too bad either. And before I knew it, I was already at the last stage, Final Egg. Like with all of Amy's other levels, this one was challenging, but not impossible. I had to do a lot of tricky maneuvering, but I'd gotten so good at evading enemies by then that this wasn't really an issue. Then I just had to go back to the egg carrier, rescue Birdie's family, and finally get my revenge on Zero. Yeah, that's what you get, you mechanized jerk! Haha! And once all that was taken care of, Amy's story was over with a total of 0 enemy deaths. Woohoo! Another day, another clean record. Now, who's next? I don't get paid enough to do this. I'll cut to the chase with this one, but Big the Cat's levels were the most boring part of this entire challenge. There were almost no enemies in any of his stages, and when there were some, they were usually far enough away that they didn't even notice me. In fact, I think the actual fishing was harder than avoiding the enemies, because look at this! This is beautiful. So yeah, I basically just slogged through all of Big's levels and nothing of note happened. Who could have seen that coming? But now we're on to our final character, E102 Gamma. This is the story I was least looking forward to, because something about this guy seems like it might be a little problem. Is it the gun for a hand, or the fact that he works for the main villain? I don't know. I guess we'll just have to find out. I should also mention that we're once again back on a time limit, and the only way to extend that time is by shooting down enemies. Hopefully this doesn't create any complications down the road, because that's not exactly something we want to be doing. The first level up was Final Egg, and it was very interesting to say the least. Eggman wanted me to shoot down this Sonic doll, which I reluctantly did. But when I finished the stage, the death wasn't added to my enemy score. I know the doll wasn't alive to begin with, but this is also a series where creepy dolls can come to life, so I just wanted to throw that out there. The next level up was Emerald Coast, and this time around, there were lots more enemies to deal with. I honestly wasn't sure if I'd have enough time to get to the end or not, but lo and behold, I finished without even having to aim my arm cannon. Nice! Afterwards, I had to sit through an entire movie's worth of cutscenes, but it was all worth it to see this part again.
Get going.
Gets me every time! Unfortunately, my easy streak was about to be broken, as Windy Valley gave me an unusual predicament. I played for the stage the same way I'd been doing this entire time, dodging enemies and whatnot. But when I got to the end, it said that I had an enemy score of 20. Huh. Well, that's strange. I could have sworn I didn't kill anyone, but maybe I made a mistake. So I tried it again, and this time the enemy score was 30. By now, I was starting to become increasingly puzzled. I tried it over and over again, and while every time I played even more carefully, things just kept on getting worse. I was having so much trouble pinpointing exactly where I was getting these points from. But after doing some extensive research, I learned that they were coming from the missiles launched by the E-Series model at the end. For some reason, these missiles are labeled as enemies, despite the fact that they're technically part of a boss fight. So once I figured that out, I just had to wait until Delta here stopped firing, and I could get the score I was looking for. After all that madness, it wasn't long before my next dilemma. You see, I was supposed to go to Red Mountain, which meant we meet again. This level was basically more of the same. Dodge all the enemies and get to the end. Same old, same old. Except this time, the timer was far stricter, which meant I basically had to speedrun the whole time just to stay alive. I actually almost ran out of time on my first attempt, but I was just barely able to squeeze out a win, damn it. Okay, my second attempt. That's better. And finally, the last stage for the final character, Hot Shelter. This was easily the hardest part of this entire challenge. Not only were there an absurd number of enemies, but some of them were put in the most ridiculous spots. For example, there were certain sections where I'd have to blow up a wall or something in order to proceed. And there was almost always a horde of enemies standing right there in front of it. Guys, come on, get out of the way! Not to mention, this level is particularly long! And with that timer constantly ticking down, it was impossible to make it through without going on a killing spree. My only option was to keep hitting checkpoints before I died, so that way I'd have a little extra time added each time I came back. This process took a really long time, and it ate up my lives relatively quickly. But with enough endurance, my plan worked and I could move on. Then I arrived at the final boss, took him down without blowing up any of his missiles, and I was officially done with all of the character stories. Oh yeah, and Supersonic. So, how many enemies do you have to defeat in order to beat all 6 chapters in Sonic Adventure DX? Well, if we add all of our murders together, the grand total is 6 enemies. Sonic had 2 of them, Gamma had 1, and Knuckles, with the hottest kill streak, came in with a record of 3 enemies defeated. I think that an average of 1 death per character is pretty alright, especially considering how many enemies are actually in this game. So at the end of the day, that's pretty neat.
Wow, that sure was an adventure. A Sonic adventure, if you will, and only 6 people died! Can you believe it? Well, if there's one thing I know, it's that I sure am tired. But all this non-killing I've been doing has made me restless, so I think it's about time I make a change. I earned this!